For more than a decade, the story of Madeleine McCann's disappearance has been held up by 7 pillars, 7 key witnesses who gave her parents an alibi, their friends. But when those friends were forced to speak in court under oath, they didn't reveal a secret. They became the secret, and what they said in those sessions destroys the one thing that has always protected the McCanns: the timeline. The story we all know is an almost perfect script of tragedy. Praia da Luz, Portugal. A group of successful British doctors are enjoying a holiday. On the night of May 3, 2007, while they are dining at a tapas restaurant, the daughter of one of the couples, little Madeleine McCann, vanishes from her bedroom. The alarm is raised, and the world is plunged into one of the greatest and most frustrating mysteries of modern history. The official narrative quickly solidifies. A brazen kidnapper broke into the apartment and took the little girl. And what supported this narrative? The testimony of their friends, the so-called Tapas 7, who assured everyone that their system of checking on the children was secure and that the evening was proceeding normally, except for the sighting of a suspicious man by one of the friends, Jane Tanner. They were the wall protecting the official story. This is the story we've been told, repeated to exhaustion. But the truth, as always, isn't in the story, but in its cracks. Our task force exists to expose these cracks. We already have investigators joining from all over the world to put these facts under a microscope. From which country are you enlisting for this mission? Leave a comment. It's always inspiring to see the global reach of our team. Now let's get back to the case. What if the protective wall built by the friends was in fact a house of cards? What if their statements, when analyzed not in isolation but together, didn't create an alibi but a paradox? The shocking truth is that the contradictions among the friends' testimonies are so severe that they make the official timeline of the abduction mathematically impossible. And exposing this impossibility is the first step of our mission, Operation Checkmate. The ultimate goal of this operation is to build the undeniable file, a public dossier of evidence so complete and logically sound that it will become impossible for the authorities to continue ignoring it. Every video you watch is another chapter we add to this file. We aren't just retelling a story. We are building the case, and today the construction begins with the demolition of the alibi. But to build this case, we first need to demolish the story they told. And the demolition begins not with the McCanns, but with the 7 people sitting at that dinner table, whose words, spoken under the pressure of a courtroom, became the most important and neglected piece of this entire puzzle. The demolition of the McCanns' alibi begins with a cold, methodical analysis of the only witness that cannot lie, cannot be intimidated, and cannot change its story: the crime scene. The official narrative asks us to believe that a kidnapper entered and exited apartment 5A without leaving a single trace. But the forensic reports, which we now add as the first piece to our undeniable file, tell a story of impossibility. The bedroom window, supposedly the point of entry, had no signs of forced entry. The only fingerprint found on it belonged to Kate McCann. The dust on the outer sill was undisturbed. Not a single hair, not a clothing fiber, not a shoe print. Forensic science tells us that the transfer of evidence is inevitable. A criminal is not a ghost. The total absence of evidence of an intruder is not a failure of the investigation. It is evidence in itself. It is the evidence that there was no intruder. The story of the abduction begins to bleed before it even leaves the bedroom. But if the physical evidence is a desert, the human evidence, the testimonies of the Tapas 7, is a swamp of contradictions. This is where the performance begins. When people experience a trauma, their memories may have gaps, but the core of the events remains consistent. When people are fabricating a story, the details change to patch up holes that appear along the way. And what we see in the friends' testimonies is a desperate attempt to maintain a cohesive timeline, an attempt that fails spectacularly under scrutiny. Let's start with what I call the broken clock. The defense of the abduction narrative rests on the idea that the children were checked on every 30 minutes, creating a very small window of opportunity for a crime. But this timeline, when put under a microscope, falls apart. The friends' own statements given to the Portuguese police and years later in court are a chaos of conflicting times. Matthew Oldfield claims to have done a check around 9:30 p.m., but he only listened at the door, not actually seeing the children. Russell O'Brien, who was supposed to have done the previous check, was tending to his own sick child, and his whereabouts at crucial moments are uncertain. The idea of a strict timed surveillance system appears to be a later reconstruction, an attempt to create a collective alibi that, in practice, did not exist. This brings us to the theater of the sighting. The centerpiece of the abduction theory is Jane Tanner's testimony, who claimed to have seen a man carrying a child in pajamas around 9:15 p.m. This sighting became the proof that a stranger was there. But this proof is a ghost. First, the description of the man and the child changed in subsequent statements. Second, and more importantly, Jerry McCann claimed to have crossed paths with Jane Tanner at that exact moment, but other witnesses at the dinner table don't remember Jerry being absent at that time. And the final blow. Years later, British police concluded that the man Tanner saw was most likely another British tourist carrying his own daughter at a different time. The sighting that propped up the abduction narrative for years was at best a mistake. At worst, a convenient fabrication. We have two conflicting versions of what happened that night. The first of a rigorous check-in system, and the sighting of a kidnapper, which supports the official narrative. The second of contradictory testimonies and a debunked sighting which destroys it. Which of these two performances seems more suspicious to you? Leave your analysis in the comments. Every theory and observation from our task force is added to our file, strengthening the case we are building together. But if the analysis of the testimonies already creates overwhelming doubt, the arrival of a new form of science to the investigation leaves no room for interpretation. In July 2007, British police sent two of their best agents to Portugal. Eddie and Keela, cadaver and human blood sniffer dogs with a near-perfect accuracy record. They are not search dogs. They are trained to detect the unmistakable scent of human decomposition. What they found in Praia da Luz was not a clue. It was a sentence. Eddie, the cadaver dog, gave a positive alert in 5 locations. 5. Not in the entire resort, not in other apartments. Only in locations directly linked to the McCanns. He alerted behind the sofa in the living room of apartment 5A. He alerted in the parents' bedroom wardrobe. He alerted on the balcony. He alerted on a cuddle cat stuffed toy that Kate McCann had carried with her since the disappearance. And most devastating of all, he gave a strong, unequivocal alert in the trunk of the Renault Scenic that the McCanns rented 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Keela, the blood dog, confirmed the alerts, indicating the presence of human blood invisible to the naked eye in the same locations. Let's stop and understand the significance of this. A dog trained to find the scent of death found that scent in a car rented weeks after the child was supposedly abducted by a stranger. The only logical explanation for this is that at some point Madeleine's body, or something impregnated with the odor of a body, was transported in that car. Science was screaming that a body had been there, in the room, in the car. A truth that cannot be ignored. So if the abduction story is a sham, what really happened that night? To answer that, we need to do what the police never did. Reconstruct the night of the crime based on the evidence, not the fiction we were sold. Forget the story of the kidnapper. The real night, based on the evidence we have just dissected, likely happened in a much more tragic and human way. Let's reconstruct that night. It's around 8:30 p.m. The children are in the apartment alone. The parents are getting ready for dinner. But something goes terribly wrong. We don't know the exact cause, and perhaps we never will. Was it a fall down the stairs? An adverse reaction to a sedative given to help them sleep soundly? A mundane household accident that, in any other circumstance, would result in a desperate call to emergency services? The fact is, when one of the parents, likely Jerry during his supposed 9:05 p.m. check, enters the room, he doesn't find a sleeping child. He finds a tragedy. There is no monster lurking outside. The monster born there within those 4 walls is panic. The panic of 2 doctors, respected figures, confronted with the death of their daughter under their care. The negligence would be exposed, their careers destroyed, their image of a perfect family shattered. In a split second, a decision is made, not the decision of a grieving parent, but the decision of a crisis manager. The first call is not to the police, it's for silence. The objective shifts from save our daughter to save ourselves. Madeleine's body needs to disappear, at least temporarily. Perhaps it's hidden inside the apartment itself, in a wardrobe, as suggested by the sniffer dog's alert. The dinner with friends, once a leisure activity, now becomes the construction of an alibi. The checks, once casual, become crucial points in a timeline being fabricated in real time. Every smile, every conversation, every sip of wine at the restaurant is now a performance. And then at 10:00 p.m., Kate performs the final act of this macabre play's first act. She runs to the restaurant, not with the cry of a mother who has just discovered a tragedy, but with the shriek of an actress who needs to convince the world of a kidnapping. They've taken her. The lie was launched, and the world bought it, but why? Why choose such a convoluted and dark path, instead of facing the truth of a tragic accident? To understand this, we need to dive into the psychology behind the mask. This is not about monsters, but about human beings terrified by the prospect of their identities collapsing. Jerry and Kate McCann were not just parents. They were successful doctors, pillars of their community, the personification of the British upper-middle-class dream. Their identity was intrinsically linked to competence, control, and perfection. A fatal accident involving their daughter, caused by negligence, wouldn't just be a personal tragedy. It would be the complete annihilation of everything they had built. It would be public proof that they were deep down flawed. And for a certain type of personality, especially those with narcissistic traits, the annihilation of the ego is a fate worse than death. The cover-up is not born from evil, but from the most primal of human instincts: self-preservation. Not the self-preservation of life, but of image, of status. The lie of the abduction, as complex as it was, offered a way out. It transformed them from negligent parents into heroic victims. It replaced shame with sympathy. It was a desperate gamble, but for them the only possible gamble to keep their world intact. They weren't thinking like grieving parents. They were thinking like strategists. And the first rule of strategy is to control the narrative. And they controlled the narrative with a mastery that fooled the world for years. So far, does this reconstruction of events seem more plausible than the story of a phantom kidnapper? Does the psychology of fear and self-preservation better explain their actions than the pain of grief? Leave your verdict in the comments. The validation from our task force is what allows us to move forward to the final proof in our case. Because the evidence I'm about to show you is not a theory. It is the proof that seals this case. The Portuguese police, led by Detective Gonçalo Amaral, had a suspicion. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, but they needed definitive proof. A checkmate. And that proof came in the form of data that cannot lie, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be manipulated. Mobile phone records. Through sources within the investigation, Amaral and his team gained access to Jerry McCann's cell phone records on the night of the disappearance. What they discovered was the missing piece, the proof that transformed the accident theory into an almost undeniable fact. According to the official timeline, at 9:10 p.m., Jerry McCann returned to the restaurant after his check and remained there with his friends. But the cell tower data tells a different story. At 10:13 p.m., minutes after Kate had raised the alarm, Jerry McCann's cell phone receives a call from his friend, Matthew Oldfield. The crucial point is not the call itself, but the phone's location at that moment. Jerry's cell phone signal did not connect to the tower that covered the Ocean Club Resort. It connected to a different tower, one that covered the area of Praia da Luz, specifically the rocky and desolate hill on the outskirts of town. An area that would later become the focus of searches for a possible body concealment site. Jerry McCann was not at the resort when he received that call. He was, or at least his phone was, in a remote location. A place someone would go to hide something, not to search for a newly missing child. This evidence by itself destroys the carefully constructed alibi. It proves there was a secret movement, an action that does not fit in any way with the narrative of a desperate father. It is the checkmate. It is the proof that from the very first moment, they were not looking for Madeleine. They were managing the consequences of her death. With the proof on the table, the question changes. It's no longer what happened to Madeleine, but who helped hide the truth. The answer involves a conspiracy much larger than just a panicked couple. It involves the power of an entire state. With the cell phone data on the table, the Portuguese investigation had what it needed to corner the McCanns. But what happened next was not a pursuit of justice. It was a show of force. The conspiracy to protect the McCanns was not subtle. It was a state-level operation orchestrated from London with a single objective: to ensure the accident theory never became the official truth. Because of the sniffer dog's alerts, the consequence wasn't a forensic excavation of the flagged locations. but a media campaign, led by British tabloids, to discredit the dogs and their handler, Martin Grime, painting them as unreliable. Because of the contradictions in the Tapas 7's testimonies, the consequence wasn't a confrontation or tougher interrogation, but the direct intervention of British diplomats who pressured the Portuguese police to treat British citizens with more respect. And because of the cell phone data, the most irrefutable proof of all, the consequence was the final blow. In October 2007, Detective Gonçalo Amaral, the man who dared to follow the evidence to its logical conclusion, was summarily removed from the case. The message was clear: the truth didn't matter. The narrative did. The narrative of an exemplary British couple, victims of a heinous crime on foreign soil, had to be preserved at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing justice itself. The system didn't fail to find the truth. The system actively worked to bury it, and this war on truth had a devastating human cost. The collateral victims of this conspiracy are many, but one of them became the symbol of injustice in this case: Gonçalo Amaral himself. He wasn't just any cop. He was one of Portugal's most respected inspectors, with a career spanning decades. He did what any good cop would do. He followed the evidence. For doing his job, his life was systematically destroyed. After being removed from the case, he wrote a book, Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, detailing the evidence he had collected. The response from the McCanns, backed by a multi-million-pound fund and a team of elite lawyers, was a legal war that lasted over a decade. They sued Amaral, had his book banned, froze his assets, and brought him to the brink of financial ruin. The man who sought justice for Madeleine was turned into the villain of the story, while those he suspected were protected by a shield of power and influence. Amaral's story is a dark reminder of what happens when you challenge power. He became the second victim of the McCann case, a man silenced for daring to speak the truth. And he wasn't the only one. Witnesses who reported strange behavior from the McCanns were ridiculed by the British press. Portuguese journalists who covered the accident theory were pressured, and in some cases fired. A curtain of silence was imposed, and anyone who tried to open it paid a high price. It's infuriating, it's frustrating. And that is exactly why this movement exists. If you also believe that the truth cannot be buried by power and silence, then this is your call to action. Officially join our task force, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every subscription is a new investigator enlisting, making our movement stronger and our voice louder. The result of all this maneuvering is that, officially, the Madeleine McCann case remains unsolved. A mystery. But it's not a mystery for lack of clues. It's a mystery by design. The accident theory, supported by forensic evidence, contradictory testimonies and cell phone data, explains all the unexplainable points of the official narrative. It explains the lack of an intruder's DNA. It explains the dog's alerts. It explains the need to rent a car weeks later. It explains Amaral's removal from the case. It explains everything. But this truth is too inconvenient, too terrible to be accepted, and so the system chose fiction over fact. Justice for Madeleine was not denied because the crime was perfect. It was denied because the suspects were too perfect. The system won. Justice was buried. But in the midst of all this darkness, one final question remains, the most personal of all. What does this terrible story teach us about our own world? And what do we do with after analyzing all this evidence is that the greatest crime in this case was not what happened in apartment 5A. It was what happened afterward, in the halls of power, the corridors of diplomacy, and the newsrooms of newspapers. What haunts me is not the mystery of a child's death, as tragic as it is. What haunts me is the ease with which truth can be negotiated, silenced and rewritten by those with enough power to do so. This case teaches us a terrible lesson. Justice is not blind. It takes sides, it has interests, and sometimes it chooses to protect the reputation of a few at the expense of the memory of others. The truth about what happened to Madeleine is not lost. It is documented in forensic reports, in cell phone data, and in the eyes of a detective whose career was sacrificed on the altar of convenience. And now, after we have gone through all this together, I need to know what this story has awakened in you. Use the comments below not to debate, but to bear witness. Bear witness to your outrage. Leave a word, a sentence that shows we have not forgotten and we do not accept the silence. I will read every comment, because in a world that wants us to be quiet, our collective voice is the only weapon we have. And for those who want to go beyond bearing witness and become an active part of building our file, there are 2 ways to do that now. Our mission to force the reopening of the case has costs. If you want to give a direct boost to today's investigation, you can use the Super Chat. Think of it as an investment in the piece we've added to the file right now. If you want to be part of the strategic core, you can become a channel member. Members are our board of investigators, helping to decide the direction of our case. It's up to you how you want to help us build this case, and it is thanks to our operators that the next mission is already being prepared. The same dynamics of power and secrets we saw in Portugal are repeated in an infamous case in the United States. In our next documentary, we will investigate how the wealth and influence of the Ramsey family may have buried the truth along with their 6-year-old daughter. To continue on this mission with me, subscribe and turn on notifications. The search for truth cannot stop until next time. Remember, the truth doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you not to forget it.